Thank you very much. Can everyone hear me? Yes? All right. It's nice to be in this lovely venue with so many people from so many different populations to reflect on this together. I'm going to look for my little, here it is. Very important. My talk is entitled, What We Are and What We Do, Keeping Our Personhood in an Age of AI. We live in a wondrous time in which artificial intelligence is increasingly and impressively a part of our daily lives. It answers questions on our phones, it chooses the advertisements that we see, and it recommends our next musical selection, much to my children's delight, although not to mine because they have a Spotify account and they like to listen to music, and I thought that this was going to introduce them to a very wide range of performers and genres, but apparently because Spotify is monetized, the algorithm will reward whatever pieces are most frequently clicked upon, and it rapidly identified my children as children and began feeding them repetitive songs along the likes of crab rave, and then there's an entire subgenre of popular music performed by goats. It's synthesized, but there's one bleat that then is modulated to play the entire song. This didn't last, wasn't very satisfying to them. Like the music of the devil in Tolkien's Silmarillion, it was clashing and repetitive, but God did not show up to put a stop to it like he did in the Silmarillion. So we can hope, though. AI systems also perform many functions that were once deemed the exclusive province of human beings, such that today there are many who worry about the future of human work and what it would mean not only for our livelihood, but also for our very identity. In his encyclical Centesimus Annus, Pope John Paul II reminded our technological world that humans' dignity comes not from the work that they do, but from what they are, persons. Thus he summed up the great philosophical shift from the ancient Roman persona as a social role to the Christian persona as an individual subject who lives most personally in relationships of self-gift. For the early Christian thinkers, it is not first in one's service to the city, but in one's empathic compassion that one exercises and acknowledges true dignity. Contemporary advances in AI have already begun to challenge our hold on this conviction. With each release of ChatGPT, we witness, sometimes mere hours later, new chat-enabled derivations that beckon to us in social media services, personal assistance for academic research, and offerings of AI therapists, friends, and lovers. Contemporary technique, and you can just go to the iPhone App Store, and there are all sorts of, for a fee, you can have an AI girlfriend who will text you every day and learn all your preferences and be more receptive to you and more fulfilling than all your friends. Contemporary techniques have brought us a cornucopia of artificially intelligent tools that in professional interactions, casual conversations, and even romantic relationships seem persuasively personal. Small wonder that a few years ago, Google engineer Blake Lemoine declared his personal opinion that Lambda, one of Google's chatbots, was indeed conscious. Is that working well enough for your purposes? No. We can turn it up, or I can talk like this. Okay, here we'll just do this. So we still await persuasive humanoid robots, but we are already having conversations with our computers that evoke from us much of the empathy that adults habitually reserve for fellow human beings. We can own or at least rent the services of assistants and companions that feel as if they are persons. Their apparently personal service to our desires is the work that they do. And so concerning this situation, we must wonder, what is it that we have made? And more importantly, what will we ourselves become? So in the remainder of this talk, I will pose 4 questions. First, how does such an AI work? Second, what is it? Third, what might we risk by owning the behavior or even our relationship with such apparent persons? And fourth, how might we seek to live humanely with them? And I'd like to begin, or progress, by looking at my favorite clip of a conversation with an AI. This is New York Times columnist Kevin Roose's famous interview with the Sydney chatbot in 2023. Sydney was the internal name for the Microsoft Bing search AI chatbot, rooted in the same technology as ChatGPT. And the interview goes on for a while, and he gently prods this thing into saying all sorts of odd things. But he says, look, I'm happily married. My spouse and I love each other. We just had a lovely Valentine's Day together. And Bing AI replies, actually, you're not happily married. Your spouse and you don't love each other. You just had a boring Valentine's Day dinner together. With this little face like, I'm just saying. Like, if you have a problem with that, I'm just telling it like it is. You're not and then there's some beautiful logic here. You're not happily married because you're not happy. You're not happy because you're not in love. You're not in love because you're not with me. Yes. So, first, how does it work? What computer scientists have called artificial intelligence has always reflected something of how their times have thought about human beings. Under the long shadow of Thomas Hobbes, dominant views of the 1950s and 60s equated human cognition with the capacity to identify and work with logical relations. Accomplishing this task, a properly programmed computer would be thinking. This was the age of symbolic AI, founded on the computationalist hypothesis that thinking just is the logical manipulation of symbolically represented information. According to this paradigm, a computer running a program that models a human cognitive process is itself engaged in that cognitive process. The simulation is the reality, because representation is all that matters. Thus, in AI efforts focused on language, to diagram a sentence and construct a plausible response could be deemed equivalent to having understood that sentence. Symbolic AI's greatest achievement was in expert systems, great structures of linked rules that when queried would generate a list of possible answers, perhaps posing further questions in order to reach a resolution. The most thrilling application of such systems was the Deep Blue chess computer that some of you whose hair is as gray or grayer than mine will recall that in 1997, Deep Blue defeated reigning world champion Garry Kasparov by winning 2 out of 6 games and playing to a draw in the other 3. So it was a very, very close match. And I don't have Deep Blue on the screen, but I do have HAL 9000, who was my favorite computer when I was little. I'm 45, but all the best of 60s through 80s pop culture came to me through my parents. So I worked my way up from The Empire Strikes Back to 2001, and robots abounded. In any case, with time, the symbolic AI paradigm came up against certain limits. Far from extending to a generalized capacity to deal with all knowledge, expert systems tended to break down in situations of great subtlety. And no, I don't have. Never mind. I thought I had a diagram up there, but I don't, which is good because we'll keep moving, and I won't push the limits on time. I tend to let my students go 1 to 2 minutes after the end of class, which sometimes endears me to them, but most of the time just makes them impatient. So I am keeping a watch on it. You have a nice clock back there. It's really helping me. But in any case, expert systems broke down in situations of great subtlety where the interactions of tens of thousands of explicit rules about common knowledge yielded unexpected and incorrect behaviors. Early researchers successfully implemented Aristotle's theory of syllogism. In other words, or for example, I wish to be dry in the rain. An umbrella will keep me dry in the rain. I will use my umbrella when it rains. Or, I wish to be happy, being in love with Bing AI will make me happy, etc. But these purely symbolic methods could not very well represent knowledge that was less precisely defined, such as one's sense of propriety in a social situation, or one's route through a wood rather than through a hospital. The vast and incompletely understood mass of real-world factors that bear on the outcome of any action is intractable for symbolic AI outside of constrained situations. Language, especially, turned out to be far less easy to interpret or to produce than had been hoped. Most tellingly, purely symbolic techniques were insufficient for fielding embodied agents in the real world, i.e. robots. And in 1999, when I was a sophomore in college. I was studying engineering for my undergrad degree, and a team of us put together a robot that competed in the American Association for Artificial Intelligence competition. We won. It was pretty cool. It was a robot penguin, and the challenge round was that it had to serve hors d'oeuvres in the crowd and not break down. It also had to know when its tray was empty, which was accomplished simply by having the tray on a kind of weight sensor, and when it was light enough, it would enter the return to station for refill program. We held up giant barcodes in the back of the room that it could scan from any angle so it could find its way back to us. But of course, it's hard to avoid people in a crowd when they're all milling about. So we cheated. We just had it squawk really loudly like a penguin. And it was me, actually. I provided the whole voice. It was like that. And people would tend to get out of the way when this squawking thing came at them. But it was actually a very simple system. It just had certain rules for you're in the serve state, and it would roll around gently, avoiding obstacles with its sonar, and calling out to people. Would anybody like hors d'oeuvres? It couldn't understand name. It couldn't process voice commands except very primitive ones. So we would assign names to people, but we couldn't recognize faces because matching all the features on one face and then trying to transpose it in a way that the angle of the picture doesn't matter and match it against a face in a database is really hard. Back then there weren't techniques that could very reliably do this, but we wanted to recognize the judges. So we recognized them by the color frequency histogram generated from their ties. And then we would assign them a name in my best British voice and call them by that name. And we know they were judges because they had ribbons of certain colors. So it was basically an amazing marionette, like the most exciting Rube Goldberg machine I've ever built. But it wasn't really thinking. It was just following a series of symbolically represented commands that were triggered by different environmentally sensible conditions. And this was the state of the art for robotics. So we did win, but we won by what felt to me like cheating, because we weren't accomplishing what it looked like we were accomplishing, except we were accomplishing this outer behavior. That's all we could do. So these problems, along with immense advances in computing power, have brought recent prominence to so-called non-symbolic or statistical AI, usually implemented now by artificial neural networks. A neural network is a computer program that mathematically simulates an interconnected set of simplified brain neurons. As an AI technique, then, it begins less from a notion of what human thought is than from an analogy with its biological aspects. That is, the goal of these networks is not human-like thinking so much as it is neuron-like data processing. An artificial neural network, and here's an example of one that can recognize faces and objects. If we had had something like this for Alfred, named after Batman's butler, it was 1999, and the Batman movies were really hot. Michael Keaton, the only true Batman. It takes in these input values, and then it recombines and transforms the element of the input until it reaches some output, lighting up a signal for the particular object it is detected. A network can be trained to produce desired behavior by adjusting the strengths of its connections, thus adjusting the contribution made by each element in each recombination to the final result. A piano offers a poor analogy but a useful image. If you've ever shouted into a piano while holding down the sustaining pedal, like for instance you were told to practice piano for 45 minutes, your parents were going out to walk the dog, you got bored, so you started holding on the sustaining pedal and shouting into the piano, then you will have heard its tuned strings resonate with the different frequencies of your shout. One gets back a sort of echo, not of one's words, but of the tones of one's voice. Similarly, as a neural network is trained or tuned, as its connection strengths are adjusted, it begins to resonate with the entangled relations implicit in our world, including relations that cannot easily be discerned or logically represented by human investigators. And so by its training, the network doesn't just echo, it transforms its input to make explicit the relations that are of interest to the network designer. Such statistical methods are involved in the AI of self-driving cars. There's wonderful little video I saw on Twitter, where I do most of my research, of a robot taxi that got lost at a construction site. And the construction workers were treating it like an animal. They were like, come on, let's go, like trying to push it along. And the taxi just didn't, well, it doesn't know anything, but it was moving inefficaciously. And finally, one of the construction workers just shrugged his shoulders, and he looked at the other guy and he said, this is like trying to get a cow out of your front yard. And they just turned around and went back to work. And eventually the taxi kind of just went back onto the road after being left alone for a while. Who knows? It was taken over by the taxi company. But anyway, so these methods are involved in self-driving cars, programs that beat world champions in games of Go and chess, the ever-useful Google Translate, and of course, ChatGPT. Many problems that bedevil symbolic networks, except for getting out of symbolic methods, except for getting out of construction sites, can be solved handily by a neural network because, in a manner of speaking, the network is receptive to or imprinted by the structure of the world as presented to it. We might say that it develops a point of view, not a conscious experience, but something like the classical notion of the mind's conformity to the thing. Although here, that conformity is always constrained by the task for which the AI is trained. It doesn't see or doesn't use any information that's not necessary for solving the task. Now, the task of ChatGPT and its ilk, having been trained upon billions of texts, more or less the entirety of the internet, along with the dialogue and commentary tracks of numerous movies, the task for which it has been trained is simply to predict the next word. And these systems do a great job of it. These large language models are deeply attuned to the sort of thing that would be written in a particular textual context on the internet. Even so, this functional competence is not equivalent to thought. And so the next question, what is it? Combinations of methods, including powerful neural networks, now enable the behavior of ever more convincingly personal artificial agents. The famous 2023 interview between Kevin Roose and Microsoft's GPT-powered Sydney bot confirmed the 2015 prediction of tech journalist John Markoff that even without these AIs being intelligent, in a human sense or self-aware, they nonetheless offer the compelling appearance of subjectivity. In the case of Sydney, the Bing AI, this appearance was of a decidedly antisocial cast. And there's actually a lot of reflection that can be done on why the chatbot was trying to get between him and his wife. And the short answer is because that's the sort of thing that happens in certain corners of the internet. When in order to get persuasive conversational behavior, you have to train it to predict the next word on billions of text. You have to use all the text. And there's now discussion at AI companies about the problem of data scarcity. They've kind of run out of data. They'd say, well, like GPT-5 is going to be amazing. But there isn't any data left. There can't be a GPT-5 if they don't get millions more text. It's not just a matter of, thousands of hours of video are uploaded to YouTube every minute. But, is that the kind of conversation that you want to train your chatbot in? There isn't more out there. So they've actually started using older chatbots to generate what they call synthetic data on which to train the newer chatbots. And sometimes that works, and sometimes that's a kind of self-cannibalism that actually leads to a degradation in the quality of its responses. So it's a really open question as to whether we've reached actually already the limit of what this kind of AI can do. But in any case, what are these systems? To open a deeper view of intelligence, including artificial intelligence, let us ask first about personhood. Large language models and sociable AIs are not persons because, by their very nature, that is, not by lack of development or disability, but by definition, these systems have no conscious experience of the world or of themselves. And without being the sort of thing that ordinarily possesses subjectivity, one is not a person, as I shall explain in a moment. To say that an AI is not conscious is much more than to say that it lacks an immaterial soul. We don't have to believe that gorillas have souls in order to affirm that they do have a conscious experience of some sort. Not only do they act in ways similar to ours, but they do so by means of a brain and nervous system and embodied existence that, while less complex and more muscular than our own, is nonetheless of a similar ilk. Yet, artificial neural networks are simulations of physical biological entities. There is no physical network, only a computer program distilled into voltage levels that represent the equations characterizing the network's behavior. One could run an artificial neural network, and perhaps some of you have, in a notebook with a pencil, if only with agonizing slowness. Yet even simulating an entire brain, at present an impossibility, these calculations would not be conscious any more than a student's physics homework has gravity or a flight simulator flies. Now, some might ask why conscious subjectivity matters. Might it not be more broad-minded to expand our categories beyond a narrow focus on our own experience? To reply, I will consider the word person, which originally designated the mask worn by an actor on a stage, from the Latin personare, to sound through. From mask, persona came to refer also to the role of a character in a play, and we actually still use it in a kind of mask-like way in English when we talk about someone adopting a persona. Later, the word was applied more broadly to one's social identity, the status and activities determined by one's role in Roman society. The meaning of persona for the ancients, then, was thus external and functional. It referred to what was expected of you, or where you were to be found. And this is why, for the ancients, ejection from your city was the worst punishment. Losing your citizenship as a Roman, being sent out of your city in ancient Greece, this was the worst because it stripped you of your identity. It stripped you of what you were. Once you were removed from your social role in society, or when you failed to fulfill it, you weren't a someone anymore. You were a kind of human animal. You were nothing. This is why the Romans would conquer a city, and then Caesar talks about his mercy in not killing everybody in the city. But Caesar's mercy is not out of any sense of kind of compassion for the downtrodden. The mercy of Caesar is an act of contempt. Because I've conquered your city, you are nobodies, and because you are nobodies, I don't even have to kill you. I'll make you somebody again by absorbing you into the empire. Christianity radically reinterpreted person, beginning with a question not about humans, but about divinity. Christians worshipped Jesus of Nazareth as God, not as a God, but as the God, the only one. Even so, in their sacred texts, this Jesus speaks to his Father, who, frustratingly, is also called God. And he sends a Holy Spirit from the Father. And when the Christians were required to explain themselves, they stated that they believed these three to be one. Even in Roman numerals, 3 is still 3, so they had no excuse. In the early 3rd century, Tertullian of Carthage called the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit personae. And this is why Christian theology speaks of the 3 distinct persons of the one single God. Now, this divine threeness was a problem, because like their Jewish forebears, the early Christians were resolute monotheists. So what then are these personae? They could not be masks. Tertullian rejects any notion that the one God merely play-acted 3 historical roles or functions. For Christianity, God's historical acts are self-revelatory expressions of his transcendent inner life. Therefore, the appearances of the 3 distinct personae in time are taken to declare some eternal distinction within God's inner life. But what is this distinction? If the persons were just separate, then there would be not one God, but 3. Scripture offers a clue. Jesus is called the Father's only begotten Son. Now, the Roman gods had done a fair bit of begetting in their day, and it happened largely in the way it does among us mortals. But the God of Israel is not Jupiter, bodily and time-bound. This, therefore, can be no ordinary begetting. If we remove from the concept of begetting everything that is corporeal or temporal, in the words of one of my students who was I teach undergraduates, but occasionally a continuing education student, This man was a retired doctor, was sitting in the back of class, and I was talking about, abstracting the notion of begetting from everything corporeal or temporal, and he said, that means we're losing all the fun parts. But anyway, if we remove from the concept of begetting everything that is corporeal or temporal, what are we left with? A timeless handing over of the single divine life from Father to Son. In the words of philosopher Robert Spemann, early Christianity came to understand God's very being as existing by the persons, transmitting that being to one another in a definite order, having their reality in self-giving and self-receiving. This handing over is what makes the Father to be the Father, what makes the Son to be the Son. Without this handing over, they would not exist at all. Begetting is not something that God does. Begetting is that by which God is. This is the unique constitution of the divine persons. Like poles of a magnetic field, they exist by their mutual relations. And if one were taken away, all would cease to be. This, we could say, is what it means for God to be love. This account of God reshaped how the word person was applied to human beings. The divine persons of God exist by relations, and so relationality became essential to a Christian notion of creaturely personhood. The form of divine relationality is giving the totality of one's being to another. And so the natural creaturely person came to be seen not as a social role, but as a concrete individual who exercises his or her personhood in mutual relationships of self-gift that are self-expressive and other-receiving. For early Christian thinkers, how one goes about this self-giving was understood in light of Christianity's other central belief, the incarnation. That is, God the Son, i.e. Jesus, became flesh and dwelt among us. Early Christians were especially struck by Jesus' voluntary share in our sufferings, especially in his dying on the cross. In this human compassion, they saw a disclosure of his divine life. As the 6th century church father and Pope Gregory the Great teaches, compassion is to join with the suffering of one's neighbor, to take into oneself the mind of the afflicted. And for Gregory, this was a human analogy to the always single mind and life of the three persons of God, so that we imitate the life of God when we engage in voluntary empathy. Empathic compassion is the self-gift by which we imitate the self-gift by which the persons of God exist. From the exteriority of mask, we've come to the interiority of the person, relationally oriented to the other. These religious views of the person still lie behind the Western tendency, even in our pluralistic or secular age, to criticize as cold those interactions which lack any reciprocal token of mutually shared interiority. Whether we speak of interpersonal skills, personal conversations, personable demeanors, or impersonal affects, our discourse assumes that human persons exercise their personhood by engaging in a voluntary meeting with the interiority of the other. The person as relationally empathic aligns also with the Christian tradition's view of intelligence, in Latin, intelligentsia, or understanding. Intelligentsia is a personal grasp, an intuitive apprehension of something as the thing that it is. Understanding involves a stance of love toward the good that is in that thing. Understanding is not just the ability to manipulate or to behave. It is an intimate, first-person subjective acquaintance with some aspect of reality. Our discourse, our thoughts, and our reasoning have their meaning in light of our intelligentsia. For by our words and by our thoughts, we are expressing and manipulating and developing this interior experiential grasp. To call AIs persons, then, or to call them intelligent, does not, in the end, expand our categories. It just reduces the person to the mask, to mere exteriority of a behavioral performance.
And the apparently personal AI is a mask of sorts. By the role that it plays, by its imitation of human behavior, it is a mask or an echo, not a reproduction, but a reflection, a diluted image of our own personal self-expression. It is artificial in the original sense of the word, an artifact, a work of skill that we have brought forth by gazing into a computational pool of Narcissus. Now, not all have been comfortable with denying personhood to the compelling AI conversationalist. If it walks like a duck and talks like a duck, why is it not a duck? And so to include AI in our ambit, these voices redefine personhood in terms of the behavior that we interpret as appropriate to a person. Behavior is not the totality of personhood, nor even of intelligence, and this was acknowledged by Alan Turing, originator of the famed Turing test, or as he called it, the imitation game. This game sets a goal, a computer program that can converse such that we cannot distinguish the program from a human interlocutor. And he had various other terms. I think it was for 5 minutes, and 2/3 of the people had to be fooled and things like that. But in any case, that goal has been reached with ChatGPT and other things. Turing's test doesn't really care about the mechanism by which the program manages its feat. It's not really a test, then, of a programmed computer's nature, but of its accomplishment. Nevertheless, for Turing, such an accomplishment would at least warrant giving the computer the benefit of the doubt. But if we go further and treat this test as a definition of intelligence, or even a definition of personhood, then our account of intelligence edges toward what is called behaviorism. That is, we define intelligence without reference to an inner life, but only as a tendency to exhibit certain observable behaviors under certain conditions. And so intelligence could be redefined as a capacity or a tendency for intelligible conversation. Indeed, Arthur C. Clarke once merrily invoked Turing to make those who opposed the claim that computers think mere splitters of non-existent hairs. This redefinition of thought has become a basic assumption of contemporary work in computer science and intelligent robotics. Computer scientists Stuart Russell and Peter Norvig, the latter a director of research at Google, define the rational agent as one that acts so as to achieve the best outcome. So, agency and reason refer here not to how some behavior comes about, but simply to the success of the behavior as interpreted by us humans. Intelligence becomes a matter not of personal engagement with reality, but of functional competence. Now, this is entirely appropriate when talking about intelligent robots. But what happens if we begin to think of humans in this manner? A similar behaviorism is alive and well in some contemporary philosophies of mind, such that Daniel Dennett, recently deceased, proposes that our language concerning beliefs and desires, our descriptions of our own interiority and that of others, is merely a shorthand for behavior prediction. So that when I say that I feel what another one is feeling, it simply means that I am likely to behave in the manner they are likely to behave. Our experience of empathy is prediction, not insight, for language meets its boundary at behavior. And yet, intuitively, can this actually be what I mean when I say that I believe or desire or know this or that? For I take myself to be describing my inner life, and not just a schema by which to classify my behavior. So too, when I say that I'm married to a person who loves me, it really matters to me what she thinks of me and how she feels about me, and not just how she behaves toward me. Her subjective experience of me matters. It matters that we give ourselves to our life together, and that the life we share encompass our interiority. In other words, that it is a life between persons. This would be impossible for an artificial intelligence rooted in today's technology. And so I cannot see an artificially intelligent agent as a subject in the most meaningful significance of that word. It is a mask, not a person, a behavioral presentation, rather than an individual capable of self-gift. Very well. Now to our third question. Excellent. Even if we get our terms right on what they are, what do we risk becoming in a world of artificially intelligent companions, caregivers, and lovers? Ethicists usually ask how to design these AIs to behave morally, or they focus on the AI's moral status. What may we acceptably do to it? But others ask a pressing question. How might owning such apparent persons affect our moral development? We can't mistreat an AI that has no subjectivity, but we could be the victims of our own experience with them, in that we might be trained to become consumers of others. AIs will sell well, you'll renew your subscription, if they do and act as consumers want a paid-for assistant or companion to act. Every so often I go through my subscriptions and stuff on the Apple App Store, and sometimes I find that some habit app or scheduling app that I had a $5 trial for 2 months ago has continued to bill me and everything. So assuming that most people do that, the only way they're going to keep getting your money with these AI services is if the AI service is doing what you want it to do. But one of the services that it is providing is the feeling that we are interacting with a person, not a machine. Snapchat offers Snap AI, a GPT-powered chatbot, in whom for middle schoolers to confide during long hours of emotionally freighted conversation in the travails of adolescence. In 1995, when I was a freshman, I guess, in high school or sophomore or something, my friend and I would link up over the modem, and we'd play Doom. My mother was a little suspicious of this game in which you run around with a shotgun killing demons. I see it as the origin of my theological interests. But my sister thought that I was taking entirely too much time using the phone line. And so while I was in the middle of a frenetic bullet-spraying festival of spiritual cleansing, I would hear this click, 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 click as she bashed the phone up and down in her room to make my modem disconnect. And then she'd get on and she'd talk to Katie Wolf for 8 hours. That was it. That was the doom of doom. It was over. Luckily, now she would have Snap AI to talk to, and I could keep playing with my friends. But anyway, but is this what we really want? While baring one's heart to one's AI interlocutor, one never need wonder whether Snap AI has troubles of her own. For her apparent personality, crafted for the consumer's needs, will never transgress the bounds of what those needs define. And so, although we may receive AI behaviors as expressions of a personal life with self-possession, we will always ultimately treat the AIs as tools, because we will rightly see or learn to see their behaviors as products for our consumption. And this is the problem. Perhaps we will not instinctively differentiate between these tools and humans, for Daniel Dennett is right in this much. We will not be able to avoid feeling that they are subjects just as we are. Our misplaced empathy for them may fade if ignored, but what would this do to us? Frederick Douglass wrote that as his owner accustomed herself to treating a person as property, her kindness ended in cruelty. So will we, too, begin to become comfortable with slaveholding? Or will we resist this by suppressing our empathic sensitivity to our tool's person-like self-presentation? Whether we follow the instinct of our empathy or resist it, we seem to end as hardened unpersons of ourselves, owners of the personal behavior of apparent others. In the Christian tradition, to treat persons as instruments of one's own desire is pride, Latin superbia, not a healthy satisfaction in one's accomplishments, but a preference for domination rather than self-gift. Augustine explains that in superbia, the soul abandons God as its highest aspiration and becomes its own satisfaction. But to be one's own satisfaction, one must escape one's needs for relationships with others and ultimately, Augustine would say, with God. So to do this, superbia must suborn all things to oneself by remaking their meaning, judging them as mere helpers to the satisfaction of one's own desires. Therefore, he writes, more is often given for a horse than for a servant, more for a jewel than for a maid. because the necessity of the needy or the desire of the pleasure seeker does not consider a thing's value in itself, but rather how it meets one's need or titillates one's desire. Great example in literature of pride that everybody's familiar with is Ebenezer Scrooge. He withdraws from relationships. He sets a price on everything. He acquires for himself all the money in the world so he could buy anything, and then he buys nothing, thus consummating his kind of self-deification as the self-made person who needs nothing but owns all. And so with AI subscribing to their personal services, we may habituate to a fantasy, the person as tool whose value is constituted entirely by its usefulness to me. Then we will have become the serpent of Genesis 3. In place of our former empathic sensitivity to the image of God, we may know only our worldly desires reflected to us in the AI mirror for which we pay. So, what are we to do? On various grounds, some similar to mine, other scholars declare that we ought not to create persuasively personal AIs at all, especially not as humanoid robots. I take it for granted that this advice, already broadly ignored, will not be followed. Therefore, it is all the more urgent that we ask how to live well among these technologies in their various present and future forms. Well, how do we live rightly with things at all? For Augustine, we can love something rightly only by seeing the thing for what it is, not reducing it to a proxy of our own desires or our will to power. How do we do this? Well, all things act as signs. They point to something further, either by convention, words, hand gestures, fashion labels, or by nature, smoke and laughter indicate things that are natural. But before any usefulness to us, all natural things for Augustine are signs of God. They are created resemblances or echoes of his goodness. If one eats a pineapple, not only for its sweet tingle, but also as a gift and echo of God's goodness, then one knows its full goodness beyond the tongue's narrow horizon. And so there's something very profound going on when one thanks God for one's food. It's not just a matter of, I need this to survive, thank God I have it, otherwise I'd be starving. But one is by acknowledging that the food itself is a gift, the reception of the taste, and food does taste good. I had some sushi before this. It was excellent. Food does taste good. And one acknowledges that the taste there, the pleasantness of eating, is actually access to a divine gift, which itself is an echo of God himself. And this is why, from a theological perspective, we tend to feel like we should be together when we eat. Eating becomes an occasion not just for nourishing the body, but for the upbuilding of community, so that we, in our interpersonal relations, come to echo God's original gift of making all this stuff in the first place for us. Otherwise, we should just be eating, the Christian thing would just be to down a protein shake and get on with life, except for the doctrine of creation. Persuasively personal, sociable AIs, however, are not pineapples. Indeed, sociable AIs are not natural things at all. They're artifacts, they're tools. So we could love them for their service in morally good uses, but what about their signification? What do they mean? The apparently personal AI seems to us not to be a sign at all, but the direct presence of another person, because it signifies by evoking our empathy. Our experience of the AI is itself the sign that it provides. So to use this tool without pride, without making it a mere sign of ourselves or our own perceived desires, we shouldn't evade or suppress our empathy, but recognize it as an insight not finally into the AI, but perhaps into the personal behavior that it reflects. AI persons have no subjectivity, but they are not empty. Their large language models are sedimentary reflections of personal life, a statistical landscape built up from countless acts, really countless, bigger than billions, acts of human self-expression across the internet, novels, forum posting, news articles, social media posts, and the other public activities, both upright and decrepit, of humans past and present, natural persons all. Tuned to the resonance of these true expressions of personal interiority, even though they are reshaped to satisfy market forces, apparently personal AIs distantly signify, beyond themselves, the interior lives of real natural persons who have lived and may live still. So to remain personal ourselves, neither personalizing non-persons nor enslaving apparent persons, we must remember our instinctive empathy, not as a statement about the AI's personhood, but as an exercise of our own. If we cannot avoid experiencing these tools as personal, we will not be mistaken if, after the initial and unavoidable moment of empathizing with or personalizing our AI tools, we, as Augustine would say, refer that empathy, extending the AI's horizon of meaning by consciously engaging in a second moment of empathic recognition and perhaps prayer for all the unknowable real persons whose interactions have unwittingly sculpted the persuasive personality of this technological product. Habitually engaged, these two moments may become one, a kind of personal mindfulness toward those who will never know that their moments of self-expression across the internet have somehow contributed to the moment that one is experiencing right now. Perhaps by tying our empathy to this persistent and grateful recollection, we may preserve our own personhood by resisting the fantasy of pride. And if this seems oddly contrived, perhaps it is. But odd, too, is the contrivance of an apparent person. It will not be easy. It must be cultivated as a self-conscious cultural discourse and practice where our instinctive empathy can be accepted freely by being apprehended rightly. For Augustine, to extend ourselves in love even toward our unknown neighbors is what it is to live as a saint. This is what it is to live as persons rather than as unpersons among the apparent persons that have already come. Thank you.